This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week my guest is Nikki Barker. Nikki's long career in horticulture has seen her work across many sectors of the industry, and she is now the Senior Horticultural Advisor at the RHS. She's just had a book published called A Gardener's Guide to Propagation Techniques, and I spoke to Nikki to get some general tips on propagation and to find out what we can be propagating at this time of year.
During lockdown, I was approached by Crowwood Press about writing a book about hydroponics, actually, which is something that I had worked on with the research scientist at Hadlow, but it wasn't my particular field of expertise. I can run a hydroponics unit, but he was the big brains there. So just through talking to them, I said there was things that I would be better able to write a book on, like propagation or compost or something, kind of as a joke. And then they said, well, actually, would you be interested in writing a book on propagation? And because we were literally shut in our house at the time, I said yes, not having any really clear idea of how to write a book or having ever done it before. So it was a big learning curve, I have to say.
I bet it was. It is really an important thing at the moment, I think, as prices go up and we're all trying to be more sustainable. So having a how-to guide is really useful. And one of the things that I was thinking about from a sustainability point of view was that obviously peat's being phased out. And I think a lot of propagation has historically relied on that as a growing medium. And I wondered if you could maybe touch on what are some good alternative proprietary growing media for propagation.
There's really good peat-free propagation composts. And by propagation composts, I mean seed and cutting composts. So ideally, you want that proprietary compost to be low in nutrients, because that is how it would be done professionally. You don't want a high nutrient content growing medium. So I felt in the book actually that it was really important to address the fact that lots of nurseries have been growing peat-free for a long time. And so a lot of the plants that you would buy have been propagated in peat-free composts. So it is perfectly doable, and also that actually we can use a lot less resources simply by looking at how professional nursery practices operate with propagation. So particularly with things like cell trays, it's not just that you're not using peat, you're using a lot less of the resource anyway. And you're going to have a better success rate too, because you've not got the transplant shock. You're not pulling the roots apart, for example, when you pop them on. So I think that whole idea of using less resources, whether you're using coir or composted bark mix, or even rock wool, is really important. And a big thing for me about writing this book was I think that when people do propagation in their gardens as a hobby, they follow rules or guidelines that maybe have been around a really, really long time and aren't actually up to date. So when we try home decorating, for example, you try and do it as professionally as possible. And yet, for some reason, that doesn't seem to be the same in horticulture. We don't necessarily look at the ways things are done professionally and try and do as similar way we can at home. And so that's puzzled me for a long time, to be honest.
I don't really know why that is, but maybe there's this kind of perceived barrier to it because we feel we don't have access to professional products as such.
I think that's right. But you know, when you buy a 6-pack or 12-pack of bedding plants, for example, from a big DIY store or a garden centre, they are cell trays and you can use those for propagation at home. And often actually when I'm doing demonstrations for work, then yes, you don't have to buy specific things, though actually cell trays are quite freely available to buy. They are plastic, but they're usually recycled plastic. They're not single-use plastics. You will use them time and time again, probably getting between 20 and 25 uses out of them, and they are recyclable. And again, you'll be getting more propagation material using far less resources, but with a higher percentage success rate. So I think it's really important that rather than still using that old 3-inch pot technique where you're putting lots of cuttings in and some of them will die off and you're using a lot more growing media than you need to, and also a lot more water. So there's lots of things about using less resources that if we just look at those best practice that's used on nurseries, we can actually incorporate into our home use, if you see what I mean.
Definitely, it'd be well worth doing, as you say, less kind of wastage.
Yeah.
I was really interested in the book because you kind of split it down into these are seeds that you can grow, these are plants you can propagate from vegetative cuttings and so on. And then you kind of rank them in terms of difficulty and ease of propagating. And I wondered, obviously, we've all got our own experiences when it comes to propagation to a greater or lesser degree. And I wondered if you could perhaps touch on, because you start with seeds in the book, are there any seeds that you find particularly tricky to germinate yourself? Because I don't know whether it's just me, but I find seeds more tricky than cuttings personally. And I know other people who find seeds much easier and cuttings harder. So there does seem to be a little bit of kind of individual, ability there.
I think certainly with seeds, a lot of the problem is knowing what the dormancy protectors might be and what you need to do to break the dormancy on the seeds. So I tend to take cuttings much more than I sow from seed. And my biggest failure actually is pyracantha from seed. For some reason, even though obviously you see them where they've been just popped up because they've gone through a bird's digestive system and all of that, I find them really difficult to break down the dormancy and grow in a propagated environment. They're much easier to take cuttings from. But there's lots of things that grow in nature because their whole evolution has been about how that dormancy is broken, whether that's going through the gut of a bird or a mammal or the cold period or all of those things. And often with seeds, it can be a cold period, warm period, cold period needed. So getting your head around that can often be quite difficult if you're collecting your own seeds. But often we buy seeds that have already had that dormancy broken. So that's why we tend to buy seeds in packets, because that job can often have been done for you.
That's actually a very good point. Some things like pop up in the garden and you think, oh, that's a doddle to get going. And then all of a sudden that you find it's not really. Also, I think that one that people might not always think about is that some seeds need light to germinate. I mean, are there any common seeds that you think people might not know that about?
There's actually quite a few. So things like begonias, so bedding plant begonias, Begonia sempervirens need light to germinate. Lobelia often is better with light to germinate. And that's when it's quite a good idea to use things like vermiculite, because you can mix the seed in with that. So it still has light, but it's still got that moisture around it that the vermiculite will absorb rather than just being laid on the top of compost. So vermiculite can be quite handy with that. And there's some seeds that they tend to be often actually, and this is a general rule of thumb because it's not always the case, but the finer the seed, the more likely it is to need light to germinate. So if you've got very, very fine seed, and if you think about lobelia seed or begonia seed, it is really, really fine, isn't it? Then it tends to need light to germinate. And I would presume that's because the way that they disperse their seed, it's too small to go down into the ground. It will just settle on the surface naturally.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that does catch some people out. I kind of teach gardening occasionally, and I notice people are quite free with their application of a top dressing of compost once they've put the seed on. So I think that's something to watch out for. And also, this episode's going to go out in the middle of September. I wondered if you could think about some good ways of propagating plants at this time of year that people could be doing now.
Well, September, certainly in the UK, is a really great time of year to take cuttings. There's lots of plants that you could be taking semi-ripe cuttings of. that could range from lavender to Prunus loricerasus to bulbae, and all points in between, actually. So things like Abelia, Ceanothus, Hebes, anything that you can get good material, the current season's growth of, that it's just starting to firm up. Now is a really good time to be doing that. So you could start doing that from mid-August through to the end of September, mid-October, depending where you are and depending on the weather. But the evergreens that you can take cuttings off this time of year that will have rooted by next spring, and then you can pop them on and be getting them out into the garden, or if you want to grow them on for longer, you can pop them on next spring and keep growing them on in containers. But it's a really good time of year to take cuttings because there's still lots of hormone available in the plant, so they do root reasonably easily. And if you can just give them a little bit of protection, a little bit of humidity, it's often easier to take cuttings at this time of year because it's not so hot. Often when you take softwood cuttings earlier in the year, if you haven't got shade net and you're not able to keep that humidity reasonably constant, they get too hot and wilt really quickly and they can get scorched. So yeah, semi-ripe cuttings are actually, I think, some of the easiest cuttings to take, and you get good success.
Thinking about the kind of amount of material that you're going to harvest from your plant and then use for propagation, do you need a particularly long piece of cutting, or can you get by with a short piece?
It very much depends on the plant, but you don't have to just use terminal tips. So if you've got a very long section of rosemary, for example, we all know how that can grow. It can put on quite a lot of growth, can't it, in one summer? So say you've got a piece that's 15, 20 centimetres long, that's this season's growth. You could just pinch the tip out and you could probably make 4 cuttings out of that. So you can separate the section of the stem all the way down. And usually there's a lot of good lateral growth on things like euonymus at this time of year as well. So generally, again, as a rule of thumb, you want to have 3 or 4 nodes on each cutting that you take. But if it's something like rosemary or lavender, obviously those nodes are really close together. They've got very small leaves, haven't they? So you just want to make that 3 or 4 centimetres long. And with larger things, like I'm using Prunus loricerasus because it's got a big leaf, but something like Aucuba would be the same. Just 2 or 3 nodes might be suitable. But you might want to cut the leaves in half because the leaves are very large and so they will lose quite a lot of water. So the size of the cutting kind of depends on the size of the plant and the size of the leaf. And the smaller the leaf, obviously the smaller the cutting will be. So if you think about the small-leafed Hebes as well.
I'm thinking about obviously overwintering them. Again, does it depend on the type of plant? But generally, would you say you don't need to give them protection?
As long as it's frost-free, generally, if you've taken cuttings in September, particularly of some of those easier evergreens like rosemary, lavender, Hebes is generally quite easy. Euonymus take a little bit longer, but usually they're rooted, certainly rosemary, within 2 or 3 weeks. So if they've rooted before October, then as long as they're somewhere frost-free, they're perfectly hardy. Just make sure that they don't get too wet over winter. And actually, I think a lot of the lack of success that people maybe have with propagating at home, and this is anecdotal, I've got no research to back this up, but just seeing what friends do, they get the cuttings to root and they might pop them on a little bit late in the season. So they're potting them on in November when actually they've pretty much gone dormant, even though they're evergreen. They're not doing a huge amount of growing at that time of year. And then they tend to get too wet and then they rot off. So if they've rooted, you can just leave them in that cell. Just make sure that it stays lightly moist over winter and then pop them on in the spring when they're coming back into active growth.
And is that when it's important to have some kind of nutrients in your compost, I guess?
That's right, yeah. When they're coming into active growth, then you want to up the nutrient content. And actually, interestingly, that's really important for peat-free composts. Peat-free composts tend to have less available nutrient than we're used to with peat-based composts. So you might want to just start a little liquid feed. It could just be a half dilute rate if you find that you're getting a little bit of yellowing on your seeds or cuttings. And this is actually something that certainly through RHS members asking us questions on this, we've had a lot of this in the last couple of years where people are trying peat-free composts and not having great success, particularly with seed sowing. And it's because they are treating the compost exactly the same as peat-based compost. So if you put them side by side and treat them as you would peat-based compost, you're not going to get such good results with a peat-free mix that is, say, composted bark or coir in whatever proportions. So you need to be much more careful about overwatering with a peat-free compost, and it does have less nutrient in. So once the seed has germinated or the cutting has taken, you will want to just up that feed a little bit quicker. And that, as I say, that could just be a general purpose seaweed feed, just a half rate dilutions when you're watering, not every time you water, just to keep the nutrient content up. I think we need to get our heads around the fact that we didn't always grow in peat. And it's the same as the changeover we had from growing in loam-based composts in the 50s, for example, moving over to peat-based composts. People found that difficult. It's just because we're used to it. So we do have to change the things that we do. We do need to be aware that peat-free composts tend to look dry on the surface, but actually be quite wet underneath. So you don't judge it by the surface at all. You need to stick your finger in and check it properly, because overwatering, obviously it's not great for the seeds or the cuttings, but it does leach out very quickly what nutrient content there is there. So we need to make sure that we're not overwatering. And often a mist sprayer is really good for that, because you're just keeping that humidity up without soaking the growing media that you're using. It's just a case of changing the techniques that you use. Peat was quite a forgiving growing medium. But if you think about it, very few things naturally grow in peat. A peat bog has very specific niche plants growing in it. It doesn't have our usual garden plants.
All of that is excellent advice, actually, and really food for thought, and a bit of a learning curve for people, but we will get there. And the other thing I was thinking about at this time of the year, I know a lot of people obviously have grown dahlias over the summer. Some people leave their dahlias in the ground. I can't really get away with that where I am. But are there any good tips for propagating dahlias?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're going to lift them and store them, do that over winter. You can actually then divide the tubers in the spring. It's not a good idea to do it now, particularly. It's certainly not something that I find I have success with over winter if you do it now. So do it in the spring. Again, just as those eyes on the dahlia tuber are just starting to swell, you can usually see where you can cut a section off, because it's like they've got great big fat sausage fingers sometimes, isn't it? And you can just cut a section off. And as long as it's got 2 or 3 eyes on it, it should divide quite easily.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I mean, I can never have enough dahlias.
They are lovely, aren't they? And actually, some cultivars are hardier than others. So there's a few that you should be able to maybe get away with leaving in the ground. I've got a couple that I leave in the ground over winter, because it is a bit of a faff lifting them, isn't it? And making sure you've got somewhere to store them. And sometimes something goes wrong and they start to rot. So Bishop of Llandaff is one that I find seems really quite hardy. I haven't lifted mine for about 5 years.
To be honest, mine would probably survive. In fact, some have, because I've just forgotten they were there, honestly, and they do come back. But what the problem I have is that they get munched off when they're in the beds early.
Oh, the slugs and snails love them, don't they?
They don't kind of survive that stage.
That is a really good point, that they can overwinter. And as you say, then they come up, and obviously it's so luscious to slugs and snails that then that kills them, because they eat all of the buds off, don't they, as the leaves coming through.
Yeah, whereas if they're in pots inside, or, you know, wherever, I can just go around and hand pick off the slugs and snails and pop them in the hedge, which is what I tend to do. But yeah.
And also you can get them big enough that when you put them outside, they can survive any further attempts at lunch.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's interesting. I know you can take cuttings of the dahlias once they start shooting, and they're actually quite easy to get going, aren't they? But do they generally form tubers if you do that?
They will do, but it takes 2 or 3 years.
Okay. This is my last question, because I could chat to you for days, I'm sure. But I wondered, what might be the easiest methods of propagation if you don't have a lot of space or equipment? And also, what are some of the easiest things to try if you're just starting out with this?
Some of the easiest methods of propagation are layering, I suppose. If you don't really have anywhere that you can take cuttings, but you've got a little bit of space, a little border, or even a window box. So you can use things like thyme and oregano, and actually things like rosemary as well. But heathers are another really good one. You can just pin a piece down in a little U shape. So the bottom of the U is just underneath the soil, and that will root, and then you can cut it off from the main plant. And that's a really good, easy propagation that generally needs no protected environment at all. So start with something like that if you haven't got much space. But as I was saying earlier, actually, if you've even just got a little sort of 6-pack of bedding plants and you take some cuttings in that, there's lots of plants that are quite easy to take cuttings from. Buddleia is a really good example. And you can take cuttings of them and leave them outside over winter. They don't need any protection. Dogwoods are another one. The coloured stem dogwoods are really good for hardwood cuttings. So going into the winter, think about taking cuttings of things like that, because they give you really good winter colour and they're very tough plants for difficult places. Holly actually takes quite well as a hardwood cutting as well. So if you're lacking in space that you can maybe cover, then certainly look at taking hardwood cuttings or layering, because it can be really successful, takes up very little resources. You can usually, if you've got a reasonable patch of ground, reasonable soil, you don't even need to buy compost. You can strike them directly into the ground. And if you start off with things like willows or buddleia, not all willows, obviously, because some of them you'll never dig out again, but some of the coloured stemmed ones, then you'll be propagating for free. Lots of places do swaps as well. Lots of local communities, when they have their horticultural flower shows, you can take stuff and swap things. So it's a really nice thing to do. I appreciate that obviously buddleias can be a problem when they escape into the wild, but there's a lot of new cultivars now that are sterile and much shorter. So look at things like that for hardwood cuttings. And it's quite a good thing to do with kids as well, because they take quite quickly and they will flower usually the first year after they've rooted. So it's one of those things, it's a good way of practicing the technique before you move on to things that are more difficult to root. You've got the technique right, but also when you have success with something, then it's a bit more motivating, isn't it? It would be like trying to, if you started off your propagation journey trying to propagate Daphnes, it would be really demoralising because they're quite difficult and they do like bottom heat and a protected environment. So start with something easy and you're practicing the technique regardless of what you're using.
It's such an amazing thing when they do actually take. And it is actually really easy with a lot of things. So you've just got to give it a go, I think.
It always puzzled me when I was teaching horticulture, because the academic year and the horticultural year are so misaligned. And it always puzzled me that we didn't just teach the technique. We would always, because of the curriculum, concentrate on you must take Prunus lorocerassus cuttings now, and then you will take these root cuttings then. And actually, we should have just been showing the students what the technique was for that time of year, regardless. And so that they had lots and lots of practice at semi-ripe cuttings, hardwood cuttings, root cuttings. Use some that were easy, that we knew would have been successful, but let them try all sorts of things, because most plants can be propagated in more than one way successfully. So if we look at how you might propagate a camellia, for example. You can take camellia cuttings in sort of February time, and you could also take them again after they've flowered. At a push, you can take them at this time of year too, if there's a bit of material available. So you can look at taking things at the time of year that suits you. It might be slightly less successful at one time of year than another, but actually, if you've got the time then and the space then, there's no reason why not to give it a try, is there?
Thank you very much to Nikki for sharing her wealth of knowledge, and thank you to you for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about a bug that's a fairly new arrival to the UK and might cause a problem with next year's bulbs. But fear not, there is a solution.
The alliums, which includes onions, shallots, leeks and garlic, are not only important as commercially cultivated crops, but are an important homegrown group of vegetables too. However, over the past 2 decades, alliums throughout many parts of Britain have been under attack from an invasive plant pest, a small 3mm long dipteran called the Allium leaf miner fly. This fly had first been reported as a crop pest in Poland during the 1950s, before spreading throughout the rest of Europe, and it eventually appeared in Britain during 2003, where it was first found in an East Midlands garden. Since then, the Allium leaf miner fly has become widespread across most of England and Wales. For allium growers, the problem starts each spring, when the flies hatch from their underground pupae to mate. Guided onto alliums by their unique aroma, the females then begin puncturing the leaves with the rear of their abdomen, before feeding on sap within some of the wounds and laying eggs into others. After a few days, the eggs hatch into tiny white maggots that then surreptitiously tunnel their way downwards inside the plant, feeding on the leaf cells as they go. But by the time they're fully grown, the damage they'll have caused inside the allium will often have enabled fungal rots to establish that can then result in wilting and death. The mature maggots, though, will either pupate within that decaying allium or in the surrounding soil, from which the second generation of leaf mining flies will hatch during mid to late autumn. And it's their offspring that will then pupate and overwinter again. Controlling an outbreak of allium leaf miner flies is tricky though, since even if you knew they were there, there's nothing that can be done to stop the maggots tunnelling inside other than destroying the affected plants. So it has to be done by preventing the adult flies from laying their eggs in the first place. Alliums therefore need to be planted or sown in a location where leaf mining flies have not previously occurred, and should then be grown, if possible, under a barrier of fine mesh netting or horticultural fleece. It's also essential to make sure any potentially infested plants are removed and destroyed during the winter months, and that the surrounding soil is regularly dug to expose the overwintering pupae to frosts and to insectivorous birds.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.